about the 30th Division, also known as the Old Hickory Division, North Carolina National Guard troops in World War I. The Raleigh area, of course, contributed their share of troops to the Great War. And those that were in the National Guard would have served in one of the units that was in some way affiliated or associated with the 30th Division. Conscript or draftee troops from this region probably, for the most part, would have gone into the 81st Wildcat Division, although they tended to go just about anywhere and everywhere. But North Carolina National Guard troops did go into the Old Hickory Division. So this is about the origin of that division, a little bit of background about the war in general, and then a little bit related to Raleigh in particular. Now, the world in 1914 was very different from what we see today. The United States had recently really made it onto the world scene in their victory over Spain during the Spanish-American War. And we had become an imperial power in certain ways by taking over Cuba and the Philippine Islands and other former Spanish possessions. Japan, where they had been swinging swords at one another up until about the 1870s, is emerging as an industrial power. They had thoroughly defeated Russia on both land and sea, which was fairly significant in the Russo-Japanese War of 1900 to 1903. So they were an emerging power. As an island nation, they realized that there are resources out there that they would like to have access to. And they had just pretty well trampled all over a major European power. So they were feeling their oats and getting kind of frisky. You had major power blocks in the Ottoman Empire, which covered most of the Middle East and North Africa. You had the Kaiser's Germany, Austro-Hungary, Russia, Great Britain, France, and then you had this spider web of entangling alliances holding these areas together. One of the best descriptions I've ever heard about how the Great War started was describing how these various blocks, you had the Russians, French, and British on one side, you had the Turks, Austro-Hungarians, Germans on the other side, each with these enormous armies which would provide a deterrent to the other so that there could be no war. And, well, that didn't work. Essentially, the world was industrializing. The countries were wealthy for the most part. There wasn't a great deal of poverty as we would think of it today. Basically, everybody was doing fairly well. There was no real reason for this war to even start, except for that spider web of alliances. But essentially, it was a powder keg awaiting a light. And as most of us who are historians know, that light was provided when a fellow named Gavrilo Princip, who was wanting to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was a very progressive, would have been an extremely progressive leader of Austro-Hungary. But when their driver took a wrong turn down an alley and they wound up right in front of this particular anarchist, he kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. Serbia gets very uptight about that. Austro-Hungary gets uptight about that, invades Serbia. Serbia goes to its ally Russia. Russia mobilizes. So Austria says, Germany, come help. Germany mobilizes. Russia mobilizes. Russia says, hey, France, you're friends with us too. Come on in. Britain says, we don't need to be a part of this right now, until Germany invades Belgium, and that's when Britain becomes involved, and now we've got a world war. All touched off by a couple of shots in Sarajevo. So this is about what it looked like. You had the one block on the German, Austro-Hungarian, then you had the British, French, Russians, Belgians, Japanese on the other. You had Italy over here trying to figure out who might win before they decided to jump into it. But they wound up on the side of the Allies before it was over with. This is a French postcard from that era, by the way. But that's about what the world looked like. Now, the U.S. Army was also an emerging military. It was a small professional army. We were in the process of growing and learning and adopting technology. We had acquired the Philippine Islands as a result of the Spanish-American War. Some people say that this war on terror we're involved in is the longest war we've ever had. Not true. In 1898, we took over the Philippines. We were fighting in the Philippines until 1913. So do the math. 15 years. We haven't quite made it that far yet. Who were we fighting? Muslim extremists in the form of the Moro tribesmen. These people had been converted to Islam back in the 16th century, even before Spain took over. When Spain took over, the Moros started fighting them. Most of them were located on the eastern end of Mindanao and in the Sulu chain. and Sulu not being the Star Trek character, but that's where his name came from. But these were in the Philippines. The Moro tribesmen were fierce. This was a warrior culture. They grew up to be warriors. They also had a thing called betel nuts, and some of the Vietnam veterans might recognize that because they were real popular in Vietnam as well. Betel nuts turn your teeth just totally black, but they also have a narcotic effect and can have different impacts on the people that chew them frequently. The higher your rank as a datu, as they called the chieftains in the Moro tribes, the higher up you were, the more betel nut carriers you had as part of your retinue, quite literally. And when they were on that stuff, they were hard to take down. They also could make an armor out of hardened bamboo. In some cases, they even had leftover stuff from when the Spaniards were occupying for about 300 years. They'd fought the Spaniards for 3 centuries, and they didn't want us there any more than they wanted the Spaniards there. So when we took over the Philippine Islands, well, guess what? They started fighting us as well. We had 2 different insurrections, essentially, a whole series of insurrections, but 2 major ones. One was against other Filipinos under the leadership of a fellow named Aguinaldo, whose son later came to head the Philippines as well. And then we had the fighting against the Moros, which went on literally for over a decade. Well, it turns out that the old Army .38 caliber pistol would not stop a charging Moro tribesman. So we had to develop something more powerful. The soldiers were writing home saying, "Hey, Ma, how about going to that bottom drawer and pull out my old Peacemaker?" The Peacemaker being the model 1873 Colt revolver. Single action, had to hand cock each round, but it was a .45 caliber. The .45 would put them down. So the Army adopted the .45 caliber again in the form of a newer weapon system in the 20th century. And eventually we wound up with the Colt Model 1911 pistol, which we see in the hands of Brigadier General John J. Pershing in one of the last major battles of the war. And that weapon served us quite well for about 80 some odd years in .45 caliber. It had knockdown power. As one veteran wrote in one book that I read, he called it the wallop factor. The .38 didn't have the wallop. The .45 did and does, and that's why .45s are coming back into our inventory today, because the 9mm that we now have translates to what? .38 caliber, 7.62, close enough, millimeter. So anyway, that's one of our earlier accounts of fighting against Moros, Muslim extremists, and it's not the first time we've been there. That's not even counting the 1803 fight against the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. So history repeats. It repeats, and nobody learns it but historians, and nobody ever listens to us. So that's just where we are. Now, another headline: American citizens murdered by foreign terrorists on American soil. National Guard gets mobilized for federal service. U.S. invades another nation without their invitation or permission to chase after those terrorists and capture their leaders. If this scenario sounds familiar, it's because it was when we went chasing after Pancho Villa. He was a Mexican revolutionary. We look on him as a bandit. They look on him as one of the revolutionary heroes of the early 1900s, when Mexico was in a constant state of turmoil with revolutions going on in the north and the south. Pancho Villa was the leader of a northwestern alliance in Mexico, and he wanted to make his government that he didn't agree with look bad, so he invaded the United States, killed a bunch of people in New Mexico, attacked a small American installation there of military people. The casualties were kind of unbalanced because he killed about 18 Americans and we killed about 67 of his people when our military guys got going with their .03 Springfield rifles and so forth. But still, he'd killed Americans on American soil. There was another incident where some of his people attacked a train, took all the men off and had them executed right there on the spot. So President Wilson ordered General Pershing to take a punitive expedition into Mexico, when the regular Army troops, most of whom had basically been dealing with remnants of some of the Indian battles and everything out west, when they had to go into Mexico, they mobilized the National Guard to go down to the border and provide border protection to keep Mexicans from illegally coming into the United States and creating more havoc. So it's not the first time the National Guard's been called to active duty. This is a photograph of some of the troops moving into Mexico. These are regular Army soldiers on the march. And the weapon system you see here has another interesting history. That is a Lewis machine gun. It was developed by an American officer, Colonel Lewis, in 1913. He developed this weapon for the United States Army when he was on duty. And the United States Army says, we don't need anything like that. What the heck do we need with rapid-fire guns? We've got these old Colt potato diggers and so on left over from the Spanish-American War. So we don't need anything like that. Well, Colonel Lewis resigned from the U.S. Army, took his patents with him, went on the road, and wound up selling the Lewis gun to Great Britain and to Belgium. So now comes our border expedition, and we're sending troops into Mexico where they have a lot of wide open terrain and excellent fields of fire for things like rapid fire weapons, but we don't have a lighter one. The Colt weighs in at about 150 pounds with the tripod, and we needed something that could be carried by one man or easily on a horse and rapidly deployed. So what are we going to do? We buy Lewis guns from the British in caliber .303 when our standard caliber was .30-06, so that created ammunition issues. But this is what they called a light machine gun. The machine gun itself weighs in at about 32 pounds. It would have a drum magazine up here, which is not mounted right now, but the drum magazine carries 47 rounds, and it could fire about 650 rounds a minute if you can change the magazines fast enough. But we wound up buying Colonel Lewis's design back and paying more for it just a few years later. It says something about military procurement, and I won't comment further on that. But it's just an interesting thing. This shows a couple of soldiers on duty in Mexico. You can kind of see the look with the short tie, and of course they're still wearing the leather belts. At this time is probably the model 1909 or one of the earlier 38s. They're not carrying the 45 at this particular time. And those are the 38 caliber pouches, so they're probably still armed with some of the older weapons, which National Guard troops usually do wind up starting out in wartime with older obsolete equipment that's hand-me-downs. So this gives you an idea of what they look like. I'm wearing a similar uniform to theirs. The campaign hat stayed until we actually got to Europe for the most part. The yellow cord on it indicates that I was a cavalryman when I started out. I'm wearing the cotton 1910 shirt, the short tie, the model 1917 breeches, and the 1910 leggings. The purpose of the leggings to protect your legs from briars and brambles and stuff like that, and also to keep stuff from getting down in your shoe when you're on the march. They are wearing the leather leggings that were frequently worn by horse troops, the wraparound leather legging. But that gives you an idea of what they looked like on campaign down there. So, the thing about the Mexican expedition itself, it was a fiasco. They wound up in a lot of pitched battles. They wound up killing a lot of Mexicans. We didn't have too many casualties of our own. We got some of the major leaders. A certain lieutenant by the name of George Patton got his first kill with a Model 73 single-action Colt revolver when he and some others did a motorized attack into a Mexican strongpoint riding in a Dodge touring car. And so that was his first real action. The good news about the Mexican expedition, though, is that it pointed out that we were way behind the 8-ball when it came to dealing with large formations of troops. We hadn't dealt with large formations of troops since the war between the states. Our logistic systems weren't there, and primarily our staff training, people up there to keep things moving, to coordinate it, to keep up with who's where and how to get them there, and okay, how many train cars are available to take these guys from point A to point B, and all the stuff that goes with them down to the last pair of spare socks. The logistics system wasn't there. They realized that. So we gave them a pretty good eye-opener saying, you know, we better get our act together because this mess that's going on over here in Europe that's been going on since 1914, and we're now in 1916 and 17, we know we're probably getting involved. People are still mad about the Lusitania and some other things, and not long after that when the Zimmerman telegram comes out. But this fellow Zimmerman happened to be a German ambassador to Mexico, and he happened to send a letter to the Mexicans saying, hey, you know, if you'll come in on our side and start a ruckus in the southwestern United States so that they won't get into the war over here in Europe, we'll let you have back some of that ground that they took away from you back in 1848 in the Mexican War, you know, like Arizona, New Mexico, part of Texas, Southern California, that kind of thing. And when that got publicized, that's what brought us into the war. And we weren't ready. The other thing that the punitive expedition did for us is it allowed a large number of National Guardsmen to experience military discipline for an extended period of time. National Guard units up to that time rarely operated in more than company strength, and it was more social than it was military when they got together for their musters and drills. They get out, do a little bit of drill, and then they'd all break to the local pub. It was a social activity more than it was a military one. And I've been in some units where that didn't change a whole lot back when I was in the National Guard. I can tell you some stories about that. Explosions rock Manhattan. The Statue of Liberty is damaged. Windows are shattered as far as Wall Street. That sounds almost like a little September 11th type scenario, doesn't it? But this actually happened in 1916. German saboteurs blew up a large munitions dump on Black Tom Island, New Jersey. Black Tom Island being directly across from New York Harbor. It's in New York Harbor, directly across from the lower end of Manhattan, and actually that part of the New Jersey shore is closer to the Statue of Liberty than is any part of the state of New York itself. It's really in New Jersey. But the explosion was so big because this was an ammo dump. This was a place where a lot of munitions were being stored and loaded onto ships to send to Europe because the British and the French were buying an awful lot of ammunition from us. And the Germans didn't like that. So they had people over here sabotaging rail systems, sabotaging dumps like this one, and doing other nefarious things. And it was mostly being overlooked because President Wilson didn't want us to get involved in the war. So this one was a big one. There was just no way to hide that. The explosion literally from the New Jersey shore of Boston Harbor was felt well up into Manhattan in New York. That literally broke windows at Wall Street. At one time, you used to be able to go up in the arm of the Statue of Liberty. You can no longer do that because of the damage sustained in the Black Tom Island explosion. Ellis Island had to be shut down for quite a while because of damage done to Ellis Island, where the point of entry for most of the immigrants coming in at that time. It was a huge explosion, but not a lot of people killed because they did it on a Sunday when there weren't too many people there other than a few night watchmen, a couple of dock workers and so on, and a baby about 2 or 3 miles away that got knocked out of its bassinet and was killed as a result of the explosion, and a few other things. But there was a lot of it going on. According to FBI records, the Germans had autonomous state-sponsored sleeper cells throughout the United States. They were already over here. The attack on Black Tom was just one of many. There were well over 40 incidents of sabotage in the United States throughout 1915, 1916, going into our actual involvement in the war in 1917. German terrorists also were developing a strain of anthrax, which they had hoped to inject into livestock that we were sending over to Europe to be processed into food for the troops in the trenches. So, germ warfare, circa 1916, nothing new. I mean, that's, like I said, you know, how creepy is that they were developing this stuff in the United States to send over to troops in Europe. There were trials, most of the activity was covered up, it was kept in secret archives for years, and not many people who haven't really dug into the history of the war even know about it. But this is the kind of stuff going on before we even got involved. The President's response to all this, when a reporter asked him what was to be done about 42 different explosions at ammunition plants and depots leading up to Black Tom, President Wilson said, well, it's an isolated incident at a private train yard. No big deal, no story, move along, move along. He didn't want to get us into it. He ran for re-election on a platform of he kept us out of the war. He kept us out of the war. That was the constant mantra. And of course, in July of 1916, when this happened, most of the media were more concerned about shark attacks in a New Jersey river, where some sharks had actually come up from the ocean into the more freshwater, brackish waters of the river and were attacking people, and they were a lot more concerned with that than they were with terrorist plots. So the press is behind the 8 ball on that one. And this is some of the result of the Black Tom explosion. So here's the United States Army in 1914. We got 85,965 officers and men. That's it. Not counting the National Guard and Reserve component. This is what we have in the regular Army, and about half of them are in the Philippines, and some of them still garrisoning Cuba, and the rest scattered in detachments all over the western United States, because we're only a few years out from when the last Sioux uprising took place with the ghost dancer incidents and battles at Wounded Knee and so on. You know, the campaign medal for the Indian Wars goes through 1890, but there was still fighting going on up well into actually after the turn of the century in some places. The largest bore of our 634 pieces of artillery was 6 inches. In Europe, they're firing railroad guns with 18-inch bores. And in 1915, President Wilson asked permission from Congress to raise the Army to 142,000 men as a training cadre for what he was going to call a Continental Army. Now, where have we heard that term before? Harkens back to the time of the American War for Independence, the Revolution. So anyway, they weren't looking too far ahead, because the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the first Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army lost more than 65,000 men killed, wounded, missing in a matter of a couple of hours. Our whole army wasn't much more than that. So the Germans looked on the United States as not much of a factor. So federal service, a lot of the troops that had been on the border in 1916 and 17, chasing after Pancho Villa or guarding the border against incursions, they get home between like January, February, March, April, up until May of 1917. And July 25th of 1917, President Wilson calls the National Guard into federal service for the World War. The staff was overwhelmed. A whole new system of national divisions rather than state regiments had to be formed, developed with a whole new table of organization and equipment. And the equipment had to be procured. Literally, our Army went from less than 200,000 men in 1916 to over 4 million men before the end of 1918. Now think about just the number of uniforms, the number of sleeve chevrons, collar discs, hat bands, all this stuff, not to mention weaponry. So there's some interesting stories behind that that could take up a whole thing. The mobilization happened. Hamlets, town and cities, people were called out. A lot of them mustered here in Raleigh. This was a major train center. And railroad center as opposed to training center. But this was where a lot of people passed through on the way to and from the various training camps further south and also up to north where the ports of embarkation were to send them over to Europe. And of course they would tend to parade through town real proudly. See the old Confederate veteran here waving goodbye to the Boy Scouts. And the towns basically turned out. There was a big surge of patriotism. I don't really have a slide representing it, but there was also a mass of anti-war sentiment. There were a lot of people that didn't see where we needed to be involved in a European war. It wasn't our fight. Why are we even messing with it? Why are we getting a bunch of people killed over there? What are we going to get out of it? They didn't want it. There were massive anti-war demonstrations. There were songs. There were parades. It was not a 100% patriotic uprising during the Great War, although it is said to be the last war we marched into singing. After it, they didn't see anything much to sing about anymore. Not the ones that were there. The birthplace of the 30th Division, which is my primary point of interest, since it is North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee National Guard troops, was of course Camp Sevier. Sevier, you hear it pronounced a lot of ways. Sevier seems to be the most popular in South Carolina. That is now a part of present-day Greenville, South Carolina. Some of the old buildings are still there, by the way, that go all the way back to that time. And it was named in honor of Brigadier General John Sevier, who was from North Carolina and what later became Tennessee, over the mountain North Carolina, which became the state of Tennessee later. And he commanded militia troops during the American War for Independence, the Revolution. So he was a North Carolina and South Carolina very popular figure. The division was composed, of course, of men from the Carolinas and Tennessee. And early orders had gone out. The 1st South Carolina Infantry arrived on July 10th of 1917. The 1st South Carolina Regiment was to later, on federal service, be renumbered as the 118th Infantry Regiment, and also became the regiment that earned more medals of honor than any other in the entire American Expeditionary Force when they got to Europe. So the 1st South Carolina made a good name for itself. General Order Number 95, War Department, July 18, 1917, ordered the formation of the 30th Division, and the division was based on the geographic region from which the troops were drawn. So when you look at divisions at that time, it told you what the geography was that they came from. Talk about how the 30th is distinctly American. 95% of the troops were American-born and American-born parents. Again, these were mostly country boys for the most part. And then they were augmented by thousands of select draft troops from Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, just all over the place. And they also had a big contingent from Kentucky, I found out later. I've even got a photograph of some of them that came in. So it was pretty much all American and mostly Southern. But we had a mix from other places as they brought in enough people to bring it up to full strength. It was dubbed Old Hickory after the warrior and statesman Andrew Jackson. Why? Well, South Carolina and North Carolina still fight over whether he was born in North or South Carolina, so they both claim him, and of course he served in Congress from Tennessee, so who better to represent those three states than Old Hickory or good old Andy Jackson there. Training began in new tactics, weapons, and procedures. Here's a picture of the rifle range down at Camp Sevier. These men are armed mostly with, in this case, the Model 1917 U.S. Enfield rifle. Like I mentioned, we couldn't make enough of the standard weapons, which were the 1903 Springfield and the Model 1911 45 pistol. Couldn't make enough, so they took three plants that were building British weapons and changed the bore from a .303 caliber to .30-06 caliber, which was what we used. Came up with instead of the pattern 14 British Enfield, we came up with the Model 1917 United States Enfield. And 30th Division troops were equipped with both during training. But when they got to Europe, something changed that I'll mention in a minute. But this is what the rifle range looked like, and a lot of that terrain hasn't really changed a whole lot, even though the town's pretty much engulfed it. They were organized under a new table of organization and equipment into the 59th Brigade, which was the 117th Infantry from Tennessee, 118th from South Carolina, and the 114th Machine Gun Battalion, which had been cavalry troops from South Carolina and Tennessee. There's not a whole lot of use for horse cavalry in the trenches of Europe with barbed wire, torn up battlefields, machine guns. Horses didn't do real well in that environment. So most of your cavalry units were converted either to machine gun units or military police. The 60th Brigade was 119th and 120th Infantry from North Carolina. The 120th was what had been the old 3rd North Carolina Infantry Regiment, and some of those units were from this area. So it's possible that some of those men came from right around in here. The divisional troops were the 113th Machine Gun Battalion, 105th Engineer, 105th Field Signal Battalion, and the headquarters troop, which had started out as cavalry and also included the 105th Military Police, which had been the 1st North Carolina Cavalry. Divisional trains, this is where they're all attached. 105th trains, military police, supply, engineer train, sanitary train. Sanitary train means medical. That's the medics. Ambulance, medical, field hospitals, and so forth. So they were the ones that supported these two infantry brigades. You also had the 55th Artillery Brigade, which was composed of the 113th Field Artillery, mostly from North Carolina, 114th Field Artillery, mostly South Carolina, and the 155th Field Artillery Regiment, which was actually pulled out of the 80th Division, which was primarily from the Virginia and Maryland area, which formed the 55th Artillery Brigade, as well as the 105th Ammo Train and Trench Mortars. These troops were separated out and did not serve with the 30th Division as part of divisional units. The artillery wound up supporting all of these different organizations that are shown over here on the left. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd Army, and the various divisions that are outlined below. They were wound up on the whole front. This patch here you might recognize as 3rd Army. 3rd Army was really formed at the end of the war. The O and the A in there actually stands for Army of Occupation. The troops that stayed behind after the main force came home, but they stayed behind to keep an eye on the Germans, make sure they didn't get frisky again too soon. They didn't stay quite long enough. This is the Victory Medal of the 113th Field Artillery and shows the campaigns that they got credit for in the 1st Army and 2nd Army area, and those are very rare if you find one of those someplace with 1st and 2nd Army on it. The Saint-Mihiel Offensive and Meuse-Argonne, which was the biggest American offensive of the entire war. The 113th was very involved in that. Now, one interesting thing about an officer of the artillery, the 114th Artillery and the 55th Brigade, this was the 114th Artillery, was mostly Tennessee, At the end of the war, Kaiser Wilhelm skipped over into Holland after he abdicated the throne. And so one of the officers of the 114th, a Colonel Luke Lee, who had been a United States Senator and then became a colonel in this field artillery unit, he decided, that somebody needs to be brought to trial for all this kind of stuff. He wanted a war crime tribunal, so he decided to work up a plan to kidnap the Kaiser in Holland. Now, Holland had not been involved in the war. They were neutral. They were totally out of it. They did not engage anywhere anyhow. Well, Colonel Lee pulled together a few folks and got into a couple of just regular automobiles and decided to drive to the Dutch border and cross the Dutch border, and he was going to take on the Kaiser. He was going to kidnap the Kaiser and bring him back for trial. And one of the cars broke down, and when that happened, they flagged down another car that was coming down the road that turned out to be the staff car of a general. And so they decided to commandeer that car, but the driver of that car says, "You ain't taking the general's car without me driving it. That's not going to happen. I don't care what rank you are, Colonel." So that driver and the guys piled into it, drove into Holland, drove into the city where the Kaiser was staying in a hotel, got into the hotel. Now, they didn't have any passes, any orders, anything to allow them to cross the border representing the United States government or the Allied command or anything else. This was just Colonel Lee and some of his people saying, "We're going to go get the Kaiser." They literally got into the room next to where the Kaiser was staying, saying they just wanted to see him, they wanted to talk to him, ask him some questions. Well, somebody got the idea, what are these people doing here? And sent for the authorities in Holland. And of course, then the word got back, hey, they're sending for some of their military people to come check your papers on this. So Colonel Lee and his people jumped in the car, drove back over into where they were supposed to be in Belgium and Germany or wherever, and that ended the attempt to kidnap the Kaiser. But it was an artilleryman from 30th Division unit that led that particular little fiasco. It was just a comic opera ending the war. And of course, the Kaiser just lived out his life in exile even after Germany started to rearm. Movement over there started in May of 1918. 30th Division units, they started to move out to the point of embarkation in New York and New Jersey. Advance camp had left on April 30th, and they passed through Raleigh. On the way there, they were greeted by the people with all kinds of bands and cheers and all that kind of thing, people giving them snacks and everything, which they very much appreciated on the ride up. Raleigh was a very important stop for a lot of troops that came both to and from training camps during the war. Many of them mentioned stops in Raleigh and how hospitable the people were. So Raleigh definitely played its part as home front support for the troops. July 4th, the 30th was ordered into Belgium under British command. Now, this is an interesting little item about our troops. This is the way they were transported in Europe for the most part, what amounts to a boxcar. They were called a 40 and 8. The reason being, up here it says Homs, men, 40, cheval, horses, 8. This car was designed to haul either 40 men or 8 horses, but it was a boxcar. There were no accommodations for anybody in that boxcar. They talked about how the dust and crap came up through the floorboards, and when it was cold, it was really cold because the sides weren't sealed all that well. They were all very drafty and all. And when you might be in one of these trains for a couple or 3 days, you've got your issue rations, and when you had to do your business, you just opened the door and did it. It wasn't a Pullman car, needless to say. But that's how they traveled, the old 40 and 8s. I think we have one here in Greensboro, where I'm from. There's an American Legion post that actually has one of those old cars out behind it. It's kind of interesting. This was a drawing done by an artilleryman in the 113th Field Artillery. He did a lot of interesting drawings, and this is exactly what he called it. Down here, War is Hell, Sherman. Ask any soldier of the 113th Field Artillery about hell on wheels. And that's about what it was. To get any fresh air, you just all had to hang out the window while you were heading down the tracks. So I think that's a pretty good little cartoon the fellow drew. Now you're on the way to the front in Belgium. You see a French soldier standing here, a poilu, as they called them. And these are the American troops, and they're still in their campaign hats. But it's kind of interesting because the weapon they're carrying is not the United States Springfield rifle or the Model 1917 U.S. Enfield. It is the Model 1907 British Enfield rifle. And there's a reason for that. General Pershing here got caught in the middle as he's being displayed here between the general from France, Marshal Foch, who was the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, and Field Marshal Haig, who commanded the British Expeditionary Force. Britain and France had been bled white. They had lost literally hundreds of thousands of men, over 1 million men each that those countries would lose during the war. Their divisions were down to the size of our battalions in some cases. So here comes these nice, fresh American troops. Well, what Foch and Haig wanted to do was take our troops and just stick them right into the top of that same sausage grinder that they'd been doing for the past couple of 3 years and just fritter them out to augment their own forces. Well, General Pershing, of course, is sitting there thinking, well, if I'm a general, what am I going to be general of if I give all my troops to these people? No, not going to happen. No way. I'm keeping my army together. So that became a big struggle. And before it was all over with, what finally happened, of course, he had the buy-in from General Wilson before he even went to Europe, that he was not going to spread his troops out. But he did realize that these guys were on their last legs. So he did actually wind up loaning some troops. And the way he did it was to give the 27th Division, which was from New York, and the 30th Division from the Carolinas and Tennessee, he gave them to the British Army. The 27th is an interesting organization. If you look at the star structure in there, what you have is a very stylized OR, and that is the constellation Orion, because the commander of that particular division was General Orion from New York, and these guys were all Manhattan-type New Yorkers. It was an interesting bunch of people to try to mix with a bunch of Southerners in the 30th Division. They didn't get along too well in some cases. They formed the United States Second Corps. And of course, the Second Corps insignia shows the American Eagle joined with the British Lion and all of that kind of thing. That's where the patch design comes from. The OH, I'll talk a little bit more about why that's laying sideways in a little while. But Pershing realized he had to do that, so he gave 2 divisions to the British, which was the 27th and 30th. He also gave 2 divisions to the French, which was the 92nd and 93rd. The 92nd and 93rd being the 2 black combat divisions that were over there. This was a time when Jim Crow was really crowing, and the American troops didn't like the black troops and so forth. So Pershing, who had led black troops during the Spanish-American War, knew that they were good fighters, as good a soldiers as anybody's. He wanted to give them a chance. He knew they wouldn't get it in his army without a lot of hassle, so he gave them to the French, who had their colonial troops from Senegal and Northern Africa and other places, and they said, hey, fine, we're glad to have them, and they gave good service. But that's another story for another time. But that's how he did it. Of course, they had to be issued with British weapons, and so here's a very famous photograph that's actually in the official history of the 30th Infantry Division, showing troops being issued with the British Enfield rifle, and kind of looking them over, trying to figure out what it's about. They found out it was a really fine weapon, and they got to liking it because this rifle has it has a little magazine underneath. The 03 Springfield and the 1917 U.S. Enfield only held 5 rounds internally. This one holds 10. When the fight gets hot, that extra 5 rounds comes in real handy. The heck of it about this picture is it's labeled as 30th Division men in the 30th Division official history, but when you look at the original Signal Corps photograph in the Department of National Archives, it's labeled as 111th Pennsylvania, the 111th Infantry, which was a Pennsylvania unit in the 28th Division, which had been thought they were going to give it to the British for a while, and they started training with the British, but then Pershing pulled them back. But those are actually Pennsylvanians in that picture, which never actually used those weapons in combat. But it's still a good shot to show Americans looking at the British weapon. First action, Ypres. This word is pronounced Eep. The British say wipers. So a lot of our guys called it wipers because that's the way it was, that's just the way they heard it spoken by their British comrades when they were fighting up there. So from August 19th to September 4th, less the artillery, of course, like I mentioned, the artillery was assigned someplace else and was getting ready for the Meuse-Argonne campaign at that point. They took part in the Ypres operation and heard about German withdrawals taking place, and the Germans were indeed withdrawing, not for the reason that everybody thought, but the Germans were withdrawing. But basically the 60th Infantry Brigade, which was the North Carolina troops, they were leading, and the division basically took the first action in Ypres. liberated the Moated Orange, Vermizeel, Lock No. 8, and Lankhoff Farm, which were big, important sites along that particular line that the British had been fighting for about 3 years and hadn't gotten. So they served on the right of the British, with the British 14th Division to the left in that particular attack. So this was our first action as far as North Carolina troops that were over there at the time. Okay, let's go. And that just gives an indication of what it would have looked like with a French Renault tank in the background and just the guys coming over, just confusion and just a real mess. But following the Ypres operation, they didn't get a whole lot of a break, because on September 22nd through October 1st came the second Somme offensive. Now, I mentioned earlier about how the British had lost literally tens of thousands of men in a matter of just a few hours in the first Somme offensive, and they didn't accomplish a whole lot when it was all over with, considering the level of loss. But the 30th was one of the divisions that got assigned to the Australian 1st Division. Now, this is interesting, the Australians being colonials as the British would think of them. The British and Australians didn't get along real well. The British and Americans didn't get along real well. We were still remembering the Revolution and the War of 1812 and didn't really trust the British. And you got to remember that a lot of Americans serving in these units, especially that New York outfit, had a lot of descendants of German immigrants as part of their troops, as well as the Irish immigrants. And needless to say, the Irish immigrants had no use for the British. So that got to be right interesting. So they assigned us to the Australians. We got along with the Australians famously. It worked out perfectly. The Aussies just had the right attitude for our type of guys, I guess. But they started the attack. I'm not going to read all these different little town names and everything. The point is that they made a strong drive and took a lot of property. A lot of the reason for that, though, is that the Germans had really withdrawn. We were fighting against rear echelon units, basically forlorn hope, suicide type units that were just there to fight to the last round, and if any of them were left alive, surrender, because they knew there was no way they would get away. And so they took a pretty good-sized amount of ground by World War I standards in that, went over the top and into the action. That's a drawing out of the official history. But the decisive blow came along the Hindenburg Line. Guess where the Germans had been withdrawing to? When the Germans were pulling out, they had been preparing the Hindenburg Line for more than 4 years. And this was the decisive blow of the war. Basically, what you've got is a major line of action. This was the strongest point of the entire Hindenburg Line. They'd been working on it for 4 years. They had concrete bunkers that went down as much as 30 and 40 feet. Right along in here in blue, I've highlighted the San Quentin Canal Tunnel. San Quentin Canal runs through Belgium. It's a very long canal which formed a large barrier because it was so wide that tanks couldn't cross it. It was so deep that you had to have ladders to get down and ladders to get up. It was just a natural trench line that had been there since the time of Napoleon. And you had several kilometers between the town of Bellecour on up to La Catalette. It was a couple of miles long, was a tunnel that was more than 30 feet underground in most places, and you had a couple of German divisions that were housed on barges inside that tunnel. No artillery could touch them. And when the attack actually went down, this was the strongest point of the Hindenburg Line. The Germans considered it to be impregnable. The British and French basically considered it to be impregnable. So what do? They send in the Australians and the Americans. Well, the 27th Division was on the left, 30th Division was on the right when the attack came in. The artillery preparation had been better on the 30th Division front, so this whole area basically had barbed wire entanglements and booby traps as much as 5 miles deep that they had to get through. The artillery preparation for the 30th was good. For the 27th, not so good. So when the 30th attacked, they were able to cross the line. This is their line on September 24th. This is their line on September 29th, and you'll notice that the 30th actually went beyond their objective of Bellecour and penetrated further because the artillery preparation had done a better job in here. They didn't suffer the kind of losses and setbacks that the 27th did up here, where it was a whole lot worse. You notice they didn't make a whole lot of penetration between the 25th and the 29th. And that was mainly because the artillery preparation wasn't as good. and they never even got to the tunnel system. And the thing was, once they got across here, a lot of the Germans that were in this tunnel were coming up behind them because they had dug out and actually had other exit points where they were coming up behind these guys, just about like in Vietnam when they had all those spider hole tunnels over there and that whole system that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong built. But this is the line of demarcation between the 29th and 30th Divisions, and you can see which one penetrated the furthest. It was really the 30th Division that broke the Hindenburg line. A lot of units claim it, but this was the strongest point, and it was the 30th that broke it. They continued their advance 20 miles when 20 meters was hard to take up until that point. The division captured 98 officers, over 3,750 enlisted men, 72 pieces of artillery, well, you can see, and they suffered 8,415 casualties in a matter of days. Now imagine what people would think if we had that kind of casualties going on right now, where we haven't had that many in over 10 years. You know, you can't trivialize any of it, but that was a lot of casualties for a short time. They were in hard fighting. They kept on moving forward, and I'm not going to, again, no point reading a whole lot of this, but the bottom line of it is they were in constant fighting for most of the month, the end of September and early October. They kept going on to Montbretagne, Beauvoir, and the 60th Brigade took a position in support near Hargecourt and Bellecourt, Bellecourt being the big town that they took beyond the San Quentin Tunnel. And then they attacked again to realign the front, and the 27th came forward. So they were fighting right up to mid-October. It was a pretty strong showing that they gave. October 11th, they occupied these areas, reached the northwestern outskirts of Saint Martin Riviere. This is all in Belgium, is where most of this fighting is taking place. And they finally got pulled out of the line and were relieved by the British 1st Division on the night of October 19th and 20th. And if you'll recall, the war ended on November 11th. So they were in some of the hardest fighting of the war right at the end. But the main point of what the 30th accomplished during this time was a breach of the Hindenburg Line at its strongest point with the San Quentin Canal and tunnel system. So they did their job and did it well. The war was over. They got credit for the Somme offensive, Ypres, and defensive sector was given to anybody that basically held a defensive position against a counterattack. That has been changed. If you look at the modern flag where they have the banners and streamers on it, that now is called Flanders because that happened in Flanders in Belgium. So those are the 3 battle honors that are allowed on the Victory Medal. This is the Victory Medal ribbon from the Great War. Here's your balance sheet. These are towns that were liberated in France, towns liberated in Belgium. As far as big towns, this doesn't even have Bellecourt and some of those others on it. And during that operation, they suffered over almost 9,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing in action. To do that. It was a very short time for a lot of men. The Medal of Honor recipients, the 30th Division was awarded more Medals of Honor than any other division in the entire American Expeditionary Force. They got 12 out of about 90 that were awarded for combat action in the whole AEF. And this tells the units. Men from the 119th, 118th Infantry. The 118th, which was South Carolina, they had started the war as the 1st South Carolina Infantry Regiment, renumbered the 118th Infantry for federal service. They got 6 out of those 12 Medals of Honor. So they did their bit. So why they wear the insignia sideways? You can see the O and the H and the 3 X's, which is Roman numeral 30. And nowadays when you see the troops of the 30th Armored Brigade Combat Team wearing it, it's long side up. And that really shows the OH, because right now it's sideways. The best story that I've heard, there's no official order saying how it was to be worn, but the way it goes from a veteran whose dad, a World War II veteran 30th Division soldier, whose dad was a World War I 30th Division soldier, said what his dad told him was that they got their uniforms issued one evening, they got their patches sent out, and they gave them to some French ladies to sew them on for a review the next day, and that's the way they came. And the general said, leave them. We haven't got time to change them. Just leave it. That's the way we're going to do it. So that's why they adopted it. Nobody really knows. This shows it being worn by an officer, and you'll notice he's wearing two on the same sleeve. They didn't really have any regulations. We didn't wear patches in the trenches. Very, very few shoulder patches were worn in the actual fighting. Most of that came after the armistice was signed on November 11th. And then they started getting new uniforms and all that for all the parades and everything. Well, he's wearing his division patch up here, Major Wentworth with the 115th Machine Gun. You can see the 115 over his infantry crossed rifles here, and his major insignia here. But this, and that little metal ribbon there shows that he was one that had done service on the Mexican border. That's the Mexican border service. He's also wearing the Army of Occupation patch that I mentioned earlier. So he just wore both patches at the time because they didn't have any regulation to wear only one on each sleeve or anything like that. So it's just kind of an interesting, when you find one of those double patch uniforms, it's a really good collectible. And this is the welcome home to the 113th Field Artillery when they got back from Europe. This is in Raleigh. This was for the parade in Raleigh as they returned right down Fayetteville Street. So we're right here at it. And the governor and a lot of other dignitaries were there, and they got a great big welcome home and welcome back to the U.S. They did their job. Now, remember when I talked about the world in 1914? This is the world in 1918, after the war. The Tsar has fallen in Russia. He's gone. Who took over? The Bolsheviks. And they evolved into the communists who would dominate that part of the world for at least 70 years, and we're still feeling the repercussions of it to this day. The Kaiser, of course, had fallen in Germany. The German army, however, did not feel that they had been defeated. Not one single Allied soldier stepped on German soil during active combat operations. The Germans basically came home to a great deal of turmoil, and of course we went into the Great Depression and all of the economic woes of that. But basically they got the idea that the civilian population had let them down, that the profiteers, primarily Jewish, and the Bolsheviks and the communists and so forth had stabbed them in the back. That stab in the back theory is one of the things that gave rise to Nazism and led us straight into the next war that happened later. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, gone. There was no Austro-Hungarian Empire. So now you got a variety of warring states, all these little ethnicities and everything that had been held together by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now they're on their own. Serbia, Bosnia, where have we heard those names before? We've had troops there not too long ago. Still fighting over there. British and French imperialism, well, the war was over. They said, okay, now we can go back to normal, just like it was before the war. So you've got a bunch of guys sitting over here in Europe deciding that they're going to just go back to all of their conquests, but the British had these troops in India who had fought in the trenches and decided, you know, we can kind of take care of ourselves now. Maybe we want to do something different. The French were still in Indochina, later to be known as Vietnam. So they just said, okay, we're going to go back to our imperialist ways. Hip, hip, hooray. The Italians decided to join in by invading Libya and Ethiopia, where they got their butts kicked by a bunch of people who were still basically throwing spears at them and still knocked them in the head. And so that all continued. The Japanese had been victorious. The Japanese took part in the Great War by taking over a lot of German bases for naval activities in the China Basin, in that part of the southern Pacific and in those islands. They came into China and saw these resources and decided they liked it and wanted to stay there. But they kicked the Germans out of their bases in China. So what happens there is they're thinking, okay, we kicked Russia's butt, we kicked Germany's butt, we bad, we can do this thing here. And that's when they started getting frisky and deciding they wanted to become a world power in their own right. So a lot has changed. And, you know, you sit here and you look at what had happened in the Ottoman Empire being broken up in the Middle East. You got a bunch of British and British and French and all sitting around. They have no idea. They just think they're all Turks. Well, they have no idea of where the Kurds were. So now you've got what should be Kurdistan is now crossing about 3 different countries, with bits of them in Turkey, bits of them in Iraq, bits of them in some of the very former Russian states in that area. And they had no idea of the difference between a Sunni or a Shiite or a Wahhab. The fact that the Iranians are more Persian than Arab. The Arabs had been promised a homeland in the Middle East by Lawrence of Arabia. They didn't get it. They're still upset about that. The Jews had been promised a homeland in the Middle East by the Balfour Declaration. They didn't get it until 1949 when they went in there and took it. We're still feeling the repercussions of that. So you start seeing how a lot of what we're dealing with to this very day has its roots in the Great War. You know, I've been asked questions a lot about it. Well, why do we even bother studying the Great War? Who cares about World War I? What happened there that's important to us now? Well, quite a bit, really. It's the first war where poison gas was used. Aircraft, lighter than air aircraft and heavier than air aircraft. Bombing of civilian targets when the Zeppelin attacks went in on London. The big gun firing on Paris, that had no military value whatsoever. Attacks on civilian populations for terrorist purposes. Tanks, heavy use of machine guns, barbed wire, just the technology, the use of wireless communications was getting started. So a lot happened in that war that would later have a very big, important part. Some people learned that the tank was going to be something, namely the Germans. Other people did not learn that the tank was going to be a big deal and didn't develop them as well. So the ideal was that we were going to make the world safe for democracy. The old world was going to be met by the men of the new world, and we were going to come over there and it was going to be safe for democracy. Well, that was the idea that President Wilson had with his 14 points. That's what the Germans were hoping for when they went to do the Treaty of Versailles. But it didn't really work out that way, and of course that led to a lot of really bad feelings that would show up just a few years later. And there was a gas casualty who survived, an Austrian corporal serving in a Bavarian regiment who was gassed, blinded for a couple of weeks, but he survived. But he was so scared he'd never use gas in combat later on, although he used it other ways that were rather nasty. This is a picture of the fella. Young man who was a failed artist, but he found himself in the Army. An interesting thing, he won the Iron Cross, which for an enlisted man didn't come easy. He was a corporal when the war ended. So his personal bravery can't be argued, but if you want to see a little bit better way to recognize the fella, give you a better idea what he looked like a little later on. Just adjust the mustache slightly. That one survived. And so we'd have it to do all over again. And now they got it right. Old Hickory would be back over there less than 20 years later. So there we have it, the story of the Great War.